all of you for being here. So, how many of you have had foods with coconut in the past week? Raise your hand. Maybe like, okay. And how about in the past month? In the past year? So yeah, it's become part of our diet almost, right? And it's kind of ironic that from what you saw in this film, that people in this region where coconut grows naturally, and it's part of their identity, it's part of their culture, they're choosing not to eat coconuts. And this is a question I asked when I was doing my field work. And I often ask them, like, what's your favorite food? And I asked to one of the protagonists you saw in the film. And they often responded that their favorite food contained coconut. It was either a coconut dessert or coconut stew. And many of them said they eat it occasionally, but I found several people that said they eat it once a year because they're trying to avoid it. So I thought it was very tragic because how about eating your favorite food just once a year because you think it's going to kill you, right? So so I wanted to answer this question, like how did we come to the point where people in this region of the country are avoiding such a meaningful tradition of food? And part of it is, the answer is in this film. But I wanted to go further in this talk to situate this contradiction, this question, this controversy about coconut in the context of the changing belief systems within global and geopolitical fields, looking at how they impact people's choices and well-being at the local level. So I want to start by showing you a clip that features a man named Paolo Realto, who is shown there, and he is the protagonist of the sequel to Raspando Coco, which is a film called Una Guardiana del Coco y Esmeraldas. We came up with this film this year, and I want to show you a clip of him and then talk about it. Be sure to read the subtitles. I think they're activated.
El cangreo de la mano grande,
because it's not it wasn't showing the subtitles. Also, the subtitles of the verses are transcribed here, but.
Cojan el cangreo de la mano grande, cojan el cangreo de la mano grande, y a la mamá no la coja, los hijos se mueren de hambre, y a la mamá no la coja, los hijos se mueren de hambre. Entonces, ¿qué quiere decir la música? El cangreo de la mano grande es el cangreo que ya ha cumplido el ciclo de desovación, que ya ha cumplido su ciclo. Ese ya te indica que ya está apto para comerlo. No la cojas a la mamá, porque la mamá es la que va a criar los hijos, que le va a dar de comer a tus hijos. Entonces, ese tipo de música, yo me doy cuenta que al pasar de los tiempos, cuando nos sentimos avergonzados y ya no cantamos el arrullo, ahí vamos deteriorando nuestra identidad, deteriorando nuestra esencia, deteriorando nuestra cultura, vamos quebrando el puente. Ahora, otra de las cosas.
Okay. So, Paolo is singing a traditional folk song, which is called arrullo, which is a music genre with root in African folklore, and it is traditional to the Pacific coast of Ecuador and Colombia. So you find people singing these kind of songs both in Ecuador and Colombia, and it uses a call and response format. And it sings of verses that have to do with their everyday life, but they also have like a ritual or religious character. But in this case, these verses, and I transcribed on the left-hand side, they include a calling or a message, a specific lesson. It says, pick the young crabs. So the crabs that have the short claws, the small claws, not the big crabs. And also don't pick the mother crab, because she is going to nourish the babies. And if you pick it, the crabs are going to die. So it's a lesson in sustainability. It's a lesson about conserving this species that is contained in this traditional verse. And in the second part of the clip, Paolo is talking about people being ashamed of singing this music. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to that in a little bit. But he's talking about crabs, which are a species that lives in the mangroves. Okay? So they are one of many different species of animals, including mollusks, fish, crustaceans, and many different kinds of birds, which have been for many generations a source of food for the people that live in the surroundings of the mangrove. So the ancestors of people here, and even people today. And so the mangrove not only has been a source of food, but it's been a natural barrier that protects communities from natural disasters. It protects against rising sea levels and erosion and sedimentation, which protect them from tsunamis and river overflows, and in general they keep them safe from these disasters. And so they have an importance both as food and as environmental protection, but also they have a really important meaning. People here have like an emotional, a spiritual connection to this forest. However, and in spite of how important it is for the people here, up to 95% of the mangroves have been cut down over the past 40 years to make room for intensive shrimp farming all along the coast of Ecuador. And in particular in Esmeraldas, it has been devastating. And this mangrove deforestation is not just a phenomenon of Ecuador, it's a global phenomenon. Especially since the 1990s, the mangrove forests have been massively destroyed to make ways for rice paddles, rubber trees, palm oil plantations, and other forms of intensive agriculture. And so this is the reason why the crab is an endangered species, okay? Because they have lost their habitat, as well as many of the other species which have served as food for these people, like I said, for so many years. And for this reason, today there's a seasonal harvesting ban that is managed by the local authorities to prevent people from harvesting crabs twice a year, so that they can ensure their survival and continue to be a resource for the people that live here. But as you saw in the arroyo, in this verse, this technology of conservation, this philosophy of conservation is already embedded in the oral tradition. These arroyos have been passed from generation to generation for centuries. And it's therefore embedded already in the cultural knowledge system, and it's furthermore an educational tool to teach the younger generations to preserve the ecosystem and preserve the food that will allow them to survive and thrive. So there are other efforts carried out in Ecuador or in particular in this region to preserve the mangroves, and it's part of that story is told in this BBC article, for which I was recently interviewed, and it just came out, so if you want to learn more, I invite you to look it up. But altogether, the arroyos, these verses, these traditional folk songs, contain vital knowledge to ensure food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is not just the access to the food. Food sovereignty refers to access to nutritious food that is going to allow people to survive, perfectly healthy food like crabs and coconuts, but also foods with meaning, foods that have a really important meaning that form part of people's identity, that connect them to their community and provide a sense of belonging to their community and also to the land, to the environment. So the philosophy contained in versus is rooted in an understanding that the health and the survival of the people is tied to the health and the survival of the environment. This is a picture of the recipe that was shown in the film, and it's encocado coconut stew made with blue crabs, which is a particularly endangered crab species that live in the mangroves in this region of Esmeraldas. And similar to arroyos, recipes such as this recipe also serve as a conservation tool for preserving the ingredients that they are made with. So blue crabs and coconuts are part of the ingredients that are contained in this recipe, and without the knowledge on how to use these crops and the meaning they carry for this community, which is contained in the recipes, there is little motivation for people to conserve the species and continue growing the crops. So together, the recipes and the arroyos are two forms of oral tradition that are technologies for safeguarding life. They promote access to culturally meaningful and healthy food. They call to protect the ecosystem that provides that food and that protects the people from natural disasters, and also provide community and belonging. And all of this involves overall well-being from the mental perspective, the physical perspective, and the spiritual perspective for these communities. So even though they are so significant and so vital from all of these perspectives, it's interesting to hear Paolo say that the younger generations are ashamed, right? They're ashamed of singing these songs. And the reason why is because they're associated with blackness. It's a music of black people, it's a music of old people, right? So that's why they're not singing. And he says, this is breaking the bridge. So when he says, what he refers to the bridge is the bridge between generations, right? So if they don't sing these songs because they're ashamed, the bridge between generations is broken, and the continuity of this knowledge is impossible, right? So during my years doing this research in different parts of the country, people have told me stories about feeling ashamed of eating certain traditional foods. A lot of the traditional foods are associated with being indigenous or with indigenous culture, black people, and also they're associated with food of poor people, okay? Food of poor people, foods that are associated with women, right? So women cook these foods, older women cook these foods, they have this knowledge, so they're stigmatized. But these prejudices against certain native foods date back to colonial times, which is the case of certain native crops like amaranth, which were vital for indigenous populations in South and Central America. And in the case of amaranth, it was banned in where today is Mexico by the Spanish colonies. But other foods like quinoa, which are now considered superfoods, until very recently, they were scorned by the elites, by the upper classes as foods of Indians. And other foods like, for example, chicha, which is a fermented corn drink, which is a very important part of indigenous culture in various parts of, especially the Andes, continues to be seen as unhealthy or unclean and dirty because it's fermented. So the ideas or the information about fermented foods that make things like kombucha and kefir so popular here, they haven't reached these people, especially the doctors that go to these communities and continue talking about these foods as unhealthy and clean, etc. So coconuts fall within a group of traditional foods which are highly saturated fats. And they have been part of the diet of people in the Americas for at least 500 years, but even longer in other parts of the world. These traditional fats include coconut, butter, and lard, And the prejudice against them is much recent, dating back to about 50 years. So I'll tell you a little bit about where these ideas came from. So this man is named Ansel Keys, and he's famous for his studies in the 1950s, which came to the conclusion that saturated fat intake, the intake of saturated foods in high saturated fat, was associated with heart disease. He was featured in the Time magazine in 1961, and by the 1970s, his recommendations or his studies were the ground for policies espoused by the American Heart Association. So American Heart Association recommendations said that people should avoid eating foods high in saturated fat to stay healthy and to avoid getting heart disease and related conditions like diabetes and obesity, etc. So what happened is that these policies didn't just stay in the US, but it was exported to the rest of the world. And how does that happen is because the rest of the world, and particularly countries in the global south, like Ecuador, they simply look to the US for guidelines. And they simply copy the guidelines from the American Heart Association, and they follow whatever guideline the American Heart Association has. And because of that reason, this idea that the saturated fat is associated with heart disease impacted people throughout the global south, but particularly countries that have these foods as part of their heritage, right? And in the case of coconut, it's countries throughout the global tropics that have coconuts as part of their heritage. Come the year 2000s, and there are new studies that debunk these previous studies and redeem the traditional foods they previously demonized, but the damage is already done. This saturated fat scare resulted in millions of people over more than 5 decades in the global tropics, in the case of coconut, turning their backs on their heritage foods and depriving them of their health and cultural benefits, because these were perfectly healthy foods. Okay, so it's a huge damage caused over many, many decades, millions of people. Okay. So these medical guidelines are unquestionably taken by medical authorities in countries in the global south, and in particular in Ecuador. This is an example of a flyer from the Ministry of Public Health where coconut is listed as a cause of obesity, and this was part of the research I did in the year 2013. Advising people to avoid coconut to prevent obesity. Okay, so coconut is specifically listed, and this is provided to people in this hospital or in all the health centers in this area. So the information, it lags, right? There's a lag. The information doesn't get there. They continue to follow these old, outdated guidelines. And these food prejudices created by Western science in these centers of research in the global north blend into the local racist belief systems, as in the case of this medical doctor in Esmeraldas that I interviewed as part of my research, who told me that black people are to blame for their health problems because of their cultural preferences for coconut and other high-calorie foods. So once traditional foods have been redeemed or in a way recolonized or rediscovered, they are rebranded as health foods and subsequently gentrified or elevated to the status of superfoods, and which are then reintroduced back to the global south as discoveries, right, as new information. And this is the case of this American entrepreneur, which is a great example, which is featured in the Smithsonian magazine as a hero. claiming to be teaching Ecuadorians how to eat healthy with coconut oil. So what I see happening is history repeating itself in what Peruvian scholar Aníbal Quijano called coloniality of power. In this case, it's a certain kind of coloniality of knowledge about food and medicine, whereby knowledge flows or circulates in geopolitical circuits following the logic of cultural hegemony. So we unquestionably take what is produced in the global north. And it follows these directions from north to south, from the urban centers to the rural areas and the global peripheries. And in these circuits of knowledge and power, these global circuits of knowledge and power, medical authorities and food industry and economic and research centers in the global north emerge as these powerful global forces, and their representatives act like new civilizing agents that destroy traditional knowledge systems at the local level. These civilizing agents include doctors, nutritionists, fitness and food coaches, school teachers, who ignore and systematically inferiorize local traditional knowledge in favor of trends and information that comes from the US and Europe. In doing so, they remove the cultural tools that these people at the local level have perfected for millennia to survive and thrive, as the examples I gave earlier. And they endanger food sovereignty and collective well-being rooted in traditional cultural knowledge systems. So throughout this process, Ecuadorians and people throughout the world, but particularly in the global south, replaced animal fats with refined vegetable oils, especially with refined palm oil. Today, palm oil is the most consumed oil in the world, closely followed by soybean oil. In Ecuador, and this is a picture from the film, this woman is teaching me how to make a hot chocolate with coconut milk. But she has vegetable oil in her kitchen, right? And it's in every kitchen of every Ecuadorian. So virtually 100% of households have a bottle of refined vegetable oils in their kitchen, which is considered a staple and indispensable food item. And as a response to higher demand for vegetable oils, in the 1960s, Ecuador started producing oil palms in plantations in coastal areas. But most of the palm oil, the oil palms that are grown in Ecuador are grown in Esmeraldas, in this region, which holds 60% of the total production of oil palms in the nation. The dependency of Ecuadorians in palm oil and the destruction caused by plantation mirrors trends around the globe, and particularly in the global south, where annual production of oil palms increased fourfold in just 20 years, with Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Nigeria spearheading the global production of palm oil. This palm oil industry is just one of many industries that have exploited natural resources in Esmeraldas in this region for over a century, including petroleum, timber, bananas, shrimping, and mining, all of which have produced extensive deforestation, river pollution, biodiversity destruction, dispossession and displacement of the population of Esmeraldas from their ancestral land, making them vulnerable to natural disasters such as floodings, which have resulted in enormous material losses and further displacement. Tragically, switching from animal and coconut to refined vegetable oils and industrialized vegetable oils as sources of fat has not made Esmeraldans healthier either. As you can see in this chart, over the past 50 years, use of traditional fats like coconut and animal fats in Ecuador have remained low, while consumption of vegetable oils, refined, industrially made vegetable oils like soy and palm has risen sharply alongside rising local and global trends in cardiovascular diseases, which continue to be the top causes of death and reduce years of healthy life for Ecuadorians. I would like to end with a hopeful note. This is Paolo again, and I recently spoke to him, who told me about this workshop he is preparing for youth in his community to teach them how to make coconut oil. Several years ago, Paolo had started an organic coconut oil business primarily geared to people in big cities and geared to tourists. Like Don Julio, the protagonist of Raspando Coco, who demonstrated the coconut oil making process, the protagonist Paolo, like Don Julio, ran out of business due to high prices of coconuts. However, I was really happy to hear when he said it's been 3 months now that since he started making coconut oil, not for sale to tourists and for people outside of his community, but for his own use, to cook at home for his family. I see this as a positive and helpful outcome, especially in the context of Paolo's broader efforts to revitalize traditional knowledge among youth in his community, which are grounded in affirmation and the value of local and ancestral resources and culture and the protection of their environment. And I want to conclude with a calling for all of us to start a diet which doesn't include or exclude specific food items, but rather a diet which is free from guilt, shame, and fear of food. What is evident from this case study in coconuts in Ecuador is that Western scientists' countless attempts at verifying the value of traditional foods through study after study, producing contradictory conclusions, has mainly generated confusion, fear, and guilt around eating traditional foods. This has only benefited the ever more profitable food industry. In this case, it's specifically benefited the highly destructive oil, palm, and soybean industries. Regardless of the food item, fear or shame should not have any place in the experience of eating because they are useless emotions that turn food into an imaginary threat, creating unnecessary stress that interrupts our ability to adequately assimilate and enjoy food, which is one of the most pleasurable of human experiences. Food shaming, which has been long experienced by people of indigenous and African descent, continues to be experienced by people consuming traditional foods today. So removing shame and guilt from our menus is imperative because they reinforce exclusion and prevent us from feeling pride in our culture. And ultimately, they prevent us from loving ourselves. My calling is for a diet grounded in the affirmation and appreciation of traditional knowledges that have been tested by our ancestors for millennia, not only for their safety, healthfulness, therapeutic value, and great taste, but more importantly for their power to generate connections to community, belonging, and respect for the land, all of which are vital to our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, not just as individuals, but as communities as a whole. There is a living archive of this life-giving knowledge in the folk songs and the recipes still sung and cooked by older men and women in Ecuador and throughout the global south. Preserving them and promoting them ensures our survival, but more importantly, they get us on a path to freeing our minds from the coloniality of knowledge that for centuries has invalidated our own ways of viewing, knowing, and experiencing the world in our own terms are for our benefit. Only when we regain control over the mechanisms to produce, validate, and transmit our own sovereign knowledge about food and medicine, only then communities of the global south will be able to reap its benefits as rightful inheritors of this cultural wealth for ourselves and for the generations to come. Thank you.